All right, let's dive into this. The Nile. This river, it sparked so much tension over the centuries.
Well, yeah.
Agreements made, way back in colonial times are still shaping things today. So we've got a ton of sources here to try to understand this whole Nile Basin initiative.
Reports, academic papers, we even have some old treaties.
Yeah, the whole shebang.
Really fascinating stuff.
It is. So, I mean, for people who might not know much about the Nile Basin, we're talking about 11 nations here.
Burundi, DRC, Egypt, Ethiopia.
Kenya.
You got South
Eritrea.
Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda, and Eritrea is kind of watching from the sidelines.
Right.
But this river, I mean, it's not just some river, right? It's the longest in the world, and it's a lifeline for millions of people.
Absolutely. Agriculture, economies, everything really revolves around this river.
Yeah, and that's where the tension comes in.
Exactly. You have these upstream nations like Ethiopia. They want to tap the Nile's potential. Think big dams, hydropower, fuel their growth.
Right, but then you have the downstream countries, especially Egypt. They get nervous. They're worried about less water flowing their way.
I can see why they'd be worried.
Of course. And on top of all that, there are these old agreements from the 1920s and 50s, back when things were, well, different.
Yeah, colonial times. And those agreements gave a lot of control to Egypt and Sudan, didn't they?
They did, and that's a big source of resentment for the upstream countries. It's understandable.
So you have this history, this tension, and now the potential for conflict.
One of the sources even used the phrase fragile peace. The potential is definitely there.
Okay, so enter the Nile Basin Initiative, created in 1999.
Right.
Trying to get all 11 of these countries on the same page.
To achieve, and I'm quoting here, sustainable socioeconomic development through equitable use of the Nile.
It sounds all
utopian.
Yeah.
It's a noble goal, absolutely. But the reality is much more complicated. The NBI is walking a tightrope.
Right, so how are they even approaching this? How do you balance all those different needs and that history?
Well, they have this two-track system going on.
Okay.
One track is all about the practical stuff.
Like what?
Data collection, helping with dam construction, getting water experts talking to each other.
Might build some trust that way.
Yeah, exactly. Laying the groundwork,
It makes sense to start with the facts, right? Get everyone on the same page about what's actually going on.
Exactly. But that's only half of it.
What's the other half?
The second track. This is about creating a legal framework, a set of rules for managing the Nile. They call it the Comprehensive Framework Agreement, or CFA.
CFA, okay.
Big idea, right?
Yeah, sounds like it could be huge. A way to move past those colonial agreements and create something fair.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But there's a catch.
What's the catch?
The NBI doesn't really have a strong legal basis. They operate on guidelines, not actual laws. Limited authority, not a lot of financial independence.
So they're trying to build this grand vision, but they don't have the tools.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in.
No kidding. And has this CFA actually been successful in, bringing everyone together?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
How is that?
The CFA was opened for signatures back in 2010.
Okay.
A lot of the upstream countries signed right away, but Egypt and Sudan, they haven't.
They're holding out. Why?
They see it as a threat to the power they've always had, worried about losing those water rights.
Makes sense. Old habits die hard, especially when it's something as vital as water.
Right, and you have to factor in the shifting power dynamics. The Nile Basin is changing, and it's changing fast.
How so?
Well, you have Egypt. They've been the big player for a long time, but they're facing problems too. Water shortages, population growth. They have to import a lot of their food.
Right, I hadn't thought about that.
And one source even quoted Egyptian officials saying, that this CFA steps on their toes, infringes on those colonial rights. They're not giving up control easily.
But then you have Ethiopia. They're building that huge dam, the Grand Renaissance Dam, the GERD.
Oh, yeah, the GERD. It's a statement, Ethiopia is trying to become a powerhouse, energy independence. They even want to export energy.
Oh.
One source even said they want to tie the region to Ethiopia through these energy exports. Pretty ambitious.
It is. And what about Sudan? Where do they fit in all of this?
Sudan's in a tough spot. Caught between Egypt and Ethiopia. They were with Egypt at first, but now they see the benefits of working with Ethiopia. Cheaper energy,
It's like a chess game, isn't it?
It really is. Everyone's making moves, trying to secure their future. It's fascinating to watch, but also kind of scary.
Yeah, no kidding. So you have this ideal, the NBI, this vision of cooperation, but the reality is a lot messier.
Oh, much messier. And that's what makes this whole thing so interesting, isn't it? It's not just about water. It's about power, politics, history, and the future of an entire region.
Absolutely. It's like a real-life drama unfolding right in front of us.
And we're just getting started.
It really is a drama, right? But with all this talk of conflict and tension, I'm curious, has the NBI been able to do anything? I mean, has there been any actual progress?
That's what's so interesting, right? Even with all the gridlock, the stalled CFA, the NBI's managed to get some things done,
Really?
especially these smaller, more practical projects.
Like what kind of projects?
Well, they have this thing called the Shared Vision Program.
Shared Vision Program.
Yeah, SVP for short.
Yeah.
It's about getting countries to work together on things like irrigation, managing watersheds.
Okay, so more about those tangible benefits, right? Things
Yeah.
you can actually see and touch.
Exactly. Show people that cooperation actually works, that it makes a difference in their lives.
It's like a confidence-building measure.
Yeah, exactly. Small wins that hopefully lead to bigger wins down the line.
Makes sense. And besides those projects, what else are they doing?
A lot of capacity building, training programs. They've created this whole network to share data about the river.
So they're giving these countries the tools and knowledge they need to manage their own water.
Right. It's an investment in the future.
Smart. But what about the G or D? I mean, that seems like the biggest point of tension right now. You mentioned it could actually be a model for cooperation. How's that?
It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
This massive dam, it's causing so much tension, but it's also forced these countries to talk to each other.
Right. They had to create that commission, the G or D Tripartite Commission.
Exactly. Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, all sitting down together, figuring out how to manage this dam.
Because they have to,
They
right?
do. And you know what? Our sources say the technical side of things, the actual cooperation on the dam, it's been pretty good.
Interesting. So maybe focusing on these big specific projects, it's more effective than these broad agreements.
It could be, yeah. And another thing to think about, the GRAD isn't funded by international donors.
It's not.
Nope. Ethiopia and their partners are paying for it.
Wow, so there's less outside influence then.
Right. These countries have skin in the game. They're invested in making it work.
That makes sense. And what about Egypt? They've been so resistant to change, to giving up any control.
Well, there have been some signs.
Like what?
They came back to the MBI in 2016, tentatively.
Oh, really? I hadn't heard that.
Yeah. They're not fully committed, but they're participating again.
That's a good sign, right?
It could be. But even if they do fully re-engage, there's still the question of how to move forward.
One of our sources suggested that maybe the MBI should focus on smaller regional projects.
Yeah, kind of like those sub-basin initiatives. Fewer countries involved, more manageable.
But wouldn't that risk fragmenting the whole thing? Everyone just focused on their own little corner of the Nile?
It's a risk, for sure.
Yeah.
You need to balance those smaller wins with the bigger picture.
It's a tough balance.
It is. And another thing we're seeing, the MBI is starting to do more than just water management.
Oh, like what?
They're getting into energy, agriculture, even broader regional integration stuff.
It makes sense. I mean, you can't separate water from everything else, right?
Exactly. It's all connected. But that also raises questions about their capacity. Can they handle all of that?
Especially with the limited funding and authority they have.
Right? And you have all these other organizations operating in the Nile Basin, too.
Like what?
COMESA, for example. They have that East African power pool thing going on.
So you have multiple groups all working in the same space.
Yeah, could be a recipe for chaos, duplication of effort.
Or it could lead to some really interesting collaboration.
Right. Who knows? It's a complex situation, that's for sure.
It really is. So as we move into the last part of this deep dive, what's the key takeaway here? What should people be thinking about?
I think the main takeaway is that the Nile Basin Initiative, it's a work in progress. It's not perfect,
Far from it.
but it shows that these countries are trying to find a better way to manage this incredible resource.
It's a reminder that these things take time, right?
They do. And there are going to be setbacks and challenges along the way.
Absolutely. But despite all that, the NBI has managed to achieve some real concrete things. Let's talk about those successes in more detail.
Yeah, let's dive into those.
So let's talk about those successes.
Hmm.
What has the NBI actually accomplished?
Well, even without that legally binding agreement, they've done a good job fostering cooperation, especially with those on-the-ground initiatives.
Right, those practical projects.
Exactly. Like the Shared Vision program, it's led to real projects that are making a difference.
So they're not just all talk.
Nope, they're walking the walk. Irrigation schemes to boost agriculture, projects to conserve soil and water, even small hydropower projects to bring electricity to communities.
So it's like a bottom-up approach.
Yeah, you could say that.
Showing people the benefits of working together at the local level and hoping it spreads to the whole region.
Exactly. And they're not just building things, they're sharing knowledge, building capacity.
Like those training programs we talked about.
Right. And that basin-wide data network. They've even set up these dam safety units.
To make sure those big dams are operating safely.
Exactly. So they're thinking long-term about sustainability, empowering these countries to manage their own resources.
It's a big picture approach.
It is. And in those areas where it's about practical solutions, clear benefits, the NBI has had some real wins.
So even with all the political stuff, progress is possible.
It is, when everyone's focused on common ground. But there are still some big challenges holding the NBI back.
Like that lack of a legally binding agreement.
That's a big one. Without that, it's hard for them to make decisions, hold countries accountable, get the funding they need.
It's like building a house on sand.
A good analogy.
Eventually, it's going to crumble, right?
Good, yeah. And even with the funding they do have, managing it effectively is another challenge.
Right, they have that diversified donor base now.
Which is good in some ways, but it also means they're always at the mercy of those donors, you know?
Priorities change, politics get involved.
Exactly. And then there's the coordination piece.
Trying to get everyone on board.
Within the NBI and with all those other organizations working in the Nile Basin, it's a lot to handle.
Sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It can be, yeah. They need to be smart about how they do things, how they use their resources, how they talk to everyone involved.
It's more than just water management, isn't it? It's diplomacy, politics, strategy.
Oh, absolutely. And you can't forget about climate change.
Right, that's a huge factor.
Huge. It's already impacting the Nile Basin, and it's only going to get worse.
More droughts, more unpredictable weather.
Yeah, it adds a whole other layer of complexity.
So, with all of that in mind, what's the one thing people should take away from this? What should they be thinking about?
I think the big takeaway is this. The future of the Nile Basin, it's up in the air. It's not set in stone.
It's a crossroads.
Exactly. These countries, they have a choice. They can stick with those old ways of thinking, where it's always about competition.
One country wins, the other loses.
Right. Or they can work together, realize that they're all connected, that their future depends on each other.
It's a tough choice, but the stakes are so high.
They are. Not just for the Nile Basin, but for how we manage water all over the world.
Because the Nile, it's really a reflection of the global water crisis, isn't it?
It is. And we see those same challenges everywhere. Rivers crossing borders, water becoming scarce, climate change making things worse.
It makes you think about that Egyptian project, the one to create a new Nile Valley in the desert.
The Tashka project, right?
Yeah, is that the future? Countries going it alone, trying to solve their own problems.
It's an interesting question. Is it a sign of things to come, or is it just a unique situation?
We don't know the answer, but these are the questions we need to be asking.
Exactly. And that's why these deep dives are so important. They help us understand these complex issues, make informed decisions.
Absolutely. We've just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore.
There is. But hopefully this has sparked some curiosity, made you want to learn more, get involved.
Because the Nile story, it's our story. It's about how we manage our resources, how we cooperate, how we face the challenges of the future.
And ultimately, it's about whether we can create a more sustainable future for everyone.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Nile Basin Initiative. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those critical thinking gears turning.